Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, where the Russian forces are managing to push the Ukrainian forces further away from Robotyne, as well as thwarting a Ukrainian attempt to cross the Dnieper River and continuously attempting their own advancements in the Kharkiv area. As for the Ukrainians, they continue their attempts at Robotyne as well as Uroshaine, and they continue their attempts in the Bakhmut flanks, where they try to gain control over Klishchiivka and Berhivka. So far, the Ukrainians are attempting to send wave after wave of armored vehicles and tanks in an attempt to destroy the Russian forces and advance through the Russian defenses, but so far the Russians are holding on and are even able to conduct counterattacks in a small scale throughout the front line in an attempt to regain lost positions across the front. And we detect yet another graveyard of Bradleys and tanks as we see the Ukrainian forces continuously attempt to gain further positions across the front line throughout their offensives. Starting out in the Zaporizhzhia front, where here the Ukrainian forces attempted an assault on Robotyne, attacking it directly head on, and they managed to actually enter the village in the first blocks, after which the Russian forces managed to push them out again and recapture some positions that they lost in the Robotyne area. Then they also, to the northeast of the village, managed to actually push the Ukrainians back from there as well, away from the first formal line of defense. So this is a development where the Ukrainian forces attempted an attack, after which they were pushed back, and then the Russians counterattacked in the east, allowing them to recapture some positions. However, we are still talking in the amount of small fields. As for the Zermayorsk area, fighting continues in this part of the front line, and we see the Ukrainian forces launching attacks on Uroshaine from two directions, from the north and the west across the river line. They continuously attack the village as they attempt to take control of it, and they've continuously been sending armored vehicles from the north and infantry, as well as armored support from the west across the river line, where the infantry try to cross over, as well as the tanks. However, as we saw in the previous video, the tanks cannot swim. Then we move on to the Bakhmut area, where here the Ukrainian forces continue their attempts at attacking the city as well as the surrounding areas. They continuously attempt to push to the north of Klishchiivka and south of Berhivka, but they are not seeing any further success so far. As for the Luhansk area, we see the fighting continuing by the bridgehead across the river line, the Serebets river line, to the southwest of Satove, as the Ukrainians are trying to push the Russians back across, and the Russians are trying to hold their positions and counterattack whenever they're able to. As for the very northern part of the Kharkiv area, the Russian forces continue their attempts at advancing and pushing further south from Vilshana and Pereshut-Rafneve as they try to reach the road between Kupiansk and the front line by the east. Then we move on to the Dnieper area, where here the Ukrainian forces attempted a crossing across the Dnieper River. Here they actually managed to cross over to the islands in between the Dnieper River and the Kherson mainland to the east of the Dnieper River. And the Russian forces actually managed to detect them and push them back across, defeating the Ukrainian forces before they're able to establish a bridgehead across the Dnieper River. So what we're seeing is that generally throughout the front line, the Ukrainian forces are attempting to establish better positions for themselves, push further in the areas of the front line in the Zaporizhzhia front, and try to establish a better position on the flanks of Bakhmut to properly encircle the city rather than their fake semi-encirclement. As for the Luhansk border area, the Ukrainian forces are attempting to defend in this area as Russian forces continuously outmaneuver and try to push the Ukrainians wherever they are weakest throughout the front line. Then we move on to this article by the New York Times after some of their journalists moved to the front line to check and assess the situation around the offensive. So, according to them, some Ukrainian brigades suffered heavy losses during the counteroffensive. At least one new brigade was so exhausted by loss that it was withdrawn from the battlefield to rebuild. And according to them, new brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine are assembled from recruits who have just completed basic training. And according to Ukrainian commanders, they are pushing recruits into battle as they are replacing their losses. So essentially the new replacements are not soldiers who have a lot of experience and training. They are ones who have little training and little experience. And some of the soldiers complain about a lack of training received in NATO countries, as well as the vehicles that they've received are not suitable enough for the tasks. And that's especially the Max Pro armored vehicle is not reliable enough, as it was designed to fight insurgents and not an army, especially one with the firepower of the Russian army. And then there's a quote, "I have lost many, and some of the newcomers are mentally broken." Then we have a couple of videos, starting out with this one where Ukrainian drones detected some Russian vehicles driving through, and with the drone checking where the armored fighting vehicle is driving, the Ukrainian forces launched artillery strikes at its position and managed to strike it with that, allegedly. Then we move on to the video here, which shows a Russian Lancet drone hitting an abandoned Ukrainian tank in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And finally, this video here, which shows Russian artillery hitting Ukrainian forces crossing across the Dnieper River in an attempt to establish a bridgehead, or at least some reconnaissance in the area of the Antonovsky Bridge. However, the Russian forces detected them and managed to strike them with artillery before they properly landed. On top of this, there was some recent update by Syriac Maps which indicates further advancements by the Russian forces in the direction of the Kharkiv area next to Kupiansk. So here the Russian forces continuously push the Ukrainian forces in the direction of the northeast of Kupiansk as they try to get closer to the highway which supplies Ukrainian forces with their supplies in this area, as well as push the Ukrainians back across the Oskar River line. So there's continuous fighting in these areas, but the Russian forces managed to advance day by day in the past few days. Over the past 3 days, they've continuously advanced without any stop. So there is an area where the Russian forces are focusing. This is similar to the bridgehead across in the southwest of Svatove, where they managed to make a bridgehead, but then after a few days of advancing, they were pushed back slightly. So most likely the Ukrainians will send reinforcements to this part of the front line as they will attempt to push the Russians back from these newly gained positions. But there's also a possibility that the Russian forces will continue to gain positions here. We'll have to see what happens, but so far it is clear that the Russians are advancing in this part of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.